Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac Address. My name's Tom Connell. I'm the club's president and also an anchor at Sky News Australia. Our guest today is James Elder, global spokesperson for UNICEF, and his speech entitled Children Under Siege, Bearing Witness from the Frontlines. He is fresh from his sixth deployment to Gaza, that's since the war began 2 years ago. And James Elder has gone to places where the world's media often cannot, bearing witness firsthand to childhoods under attack or taken. With frontline experience in some of the world's conflicts of our time, including Ukraine, Afghanistan, Sudan and Haiti, James can outline the unique difference he has seen in the war in Gaza in particular, including new threats in conflict zones and what children will truly need again once a ceasefire is reached. He has 25 years of experience in journalism, communication and emergency responses. He did begin his career as well as a journalist in Australia, writing for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Australian. And he was born and raised in nearby Goulburn, so quite a few of the Elder clan is in the room, of course. James, welcome to the National Press Club, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome James Elder.
Thanks so much, Tom, Morris, everyone. Thanks for being here. Thanks also to Nick for writing out these last couple of years. I've tried to understand, just make sense of what these last few years have been around the world. To two of my kids, Jazz and Seb. I have another one who's in the air somewhere and has very much been present these last couple of years. To you both for helping me see how your generation sees events in the world today. I'm forever grateful. But to everyone else, please rest assured, today what I share is not an emotional response. It's one driven in evidence. It's one driven in data. It's one based on many testimonies of those people who've lived it. Look, let's start in Gaza. From my very first hours in Gaza 2 years ago, something just felt wrong. It felt off. The picture that had been painted for the world was not the one that was unfolding before me. So 2 years ago, Nasser Hospital, it's in the south, and it's a war zone. There's just no other way to put it. There are dead bodies outside the hospital. There are children with mutilated wounds inside the hospital. There are the young and the elderly on stretchers on hospital floors. There are family members scrambling for care. It is, as I say, a war zone, and I'd never seen a hospital in, as Tom said, in my 20 plus years, particularly for UNICEF, like that. There were doctors running around trying to differentiate between the critical and the hopeless based on the colour of blanket that they place on them. So in that context, a medic suddenly was running with me and he said, there's a bus that's just arrived from Al Shifa Hospital in the north with wounded children. We've got to go to that. Now, I can no longer picture every wounded child on that bus, but the smell has never left me. And I went as far as researching that smell. And the best I can come up with is it's a mix of chemicals from the bombs, from burning debris, but also from decomposing flesh of some of those children. In that bus, though, two of them I could see very clearly, like today. They were motionless. There was a boy, he was about 12. He had horrific burns and shrapnel wounds to his face. And then there was a little girl, 9 or 10, hard to tell because the bandage wrapped crudely around her head, trying to keep her skull in place. And I can see those kids, they were just frozen. They just sat there, literally eyes wide, empty, as if their world had stopped making sense. Looking back, even at that time, it's hard to understand how things in Gaza went on and on and on. After the horrors of October 7, 2023, when 38 Israeli children were killed and 42 children were abducted, some of whom never went home, then the relentless attacks that followed in Gaza in those first weeks alone should have been enough for the world to say, stop, no more. But nothing stopped. Now, a day or two later from being at Nasser Hospital, I was headed to the north of Gaza. It was a convoy. Right? It was a UNICEF convoy, medicines, water, hygiene kits. I got out in Gaza City as we waited to go further north, and I'm just walking amongst the rubble. There was a particular 3-story building that really struck me. I was just looking at it because the whole external wall had been blown out, so I could just see a couch. I could see, a rack of clothes. It looked like a doll's house. And I was just staring at this place, and suddenly, bang, there was a man there watching me sift through, what was his life. And we looked at each other, and he just made this motion. He spoke no English, and my Arabic not nearly good enough. And he just made this motion to me with his hands, just as if to say, just gone. He walked me then through, up the stairs. Amazing, a building gets a missile through it, part of it stands. He walked me through to the second level. He was explaining he had been somehow working outside, and a missile had come through the kitchen, and the kitchen living room around dinner time. That's where everyone had been. And again, this look, just gone. And I thought he said a word, tisa, my Arabic again, which is 9. And he could see I was struck with the enormity of this. 9 members of his family all killed. But he took me outside and he wrote in the dirt, not 9, 30. 30. Everyone. It was his wife, it was his children, it was his grandchildren, it was his brother and sister, it was their children, it was everyone. But here's the thing, despite moments like that, I kept reading, I kept being told that it couldn't be what it seemed. The world had a very different script to what I was seeing. I was constantly reminded, we all were, right? War is messy, information is complex, truth has layers. Time after time we were assured there were reasons for what's happening, always reasons, strategic, political, even moral reasons. Or instead of justifications for what was taking place against children and civilians, there was often just silence. Too often for me, there was silence. UNICEF, to my pride, UNICEF was not silent. 2 years ago, we called these attacks indiscriminate. That matters because there's a subjectiveness to that, and within our mandate, we would not do that. But it was so clear the level of devastation, we called it indiscriminate. Now there are reports of tens of thousands of children killed. We warned of starvation if aid kept being denied, and we saw famine. We warned of disease, given the devastation to water systems and the deprivation of water and sanitation, and we saw polio. Now all this is not to say told you so. It is, however, to say that the United Nations and many aid agencies and brave Palestinian journalists were saying it, and no one was listened to. And now we have 20,000 children reportedly killed. It's a girl or a boy every hour for 2 years, every hour. It's 1,000 babies killed before their first birthday. How on earth does that not resonate? Now, it's not my role to work out why this has been allowed to happen, but certainly the reflex to defer to a government statement, irrespective of its track record, could be seen as a structural flaw in how this conflict has been portrayed. Such impunity has put the laws of war under great, probably historic stress. And this is a particularly stark warning because international humanitarian law, it's not an aspirational ideal, right? It represents the bare level that humanity agreed to on the back of, periods like this. So international humanitarian law is the floor, not the ceiling. In Sudan today, the laws of war are being absolutely shredded after more than a year under siege. El Fasher, what was the government's last held city, has been engulfed by mass atrocities. And again, this is not fog of war ambiguity. It's a pattern being documented in real time. I remember very well meeting a mum in West Darfur who was so stressed by the siege and the attacks that she gave birth 2 months premature. And while she was giving birth 2 months premature in her home was bombed. Somehow she gave birth, somehow she then survived, kept her child alive as she dodged through massacres and so on. But by the time she got to a UNICEF nutrition centre, the baby was very badly malnourished. And I'll always remember the look of this mother. She had her head bowed and she was quite a whisper. And she's like, I'm a nutritionist, but look at my child. She was ashamed. I thought she was heroic, right? She kept her child alive. I was also in Darfur 20 years ago And that was in the early 2000s when celebrities and internationally renowned journalists would make the trek and focus attention on atrocities there. But now, as the warring parties are tearing that country apart, there are no Hollywood actors, there's no coordinated media attention to tackle what is the largest displacement crisis in the world for children. Numbers. There are 5 million children displaced in Sudan, which is, ironically, how many children there are in Australia. So every single Australian child displaced. This word displacement, it's unusual because it conveys movement, but not the retching grief behind it. Displacement, it's not abstract, it's not neutral, it's repetitious, it's violent, and it's devastating. And I think when we talk of people being displaced, there's a temptation when you talk of it and the suffering behind it, that we reach for soft, universal language, resilience and courage, terms like this. And look, they have their place, they certainly do. But reality demands that we speak very plainly about these things. Displacement in Sudan, as in Gaza, it's not an unfortunate byproduct of conflict, it's a consequence of massive, indiscriminate attacks and an utter disregard of international laws. So, in Sudan, all need to do much more to negotiate a ceasefire, ensure aid is no longer blocked. Those in the region need to show leadership, and those in donor countries need to show compassion and translate that compassion to funding. Yes, funding. Money matters everywhere. Ladies and gentlemen, right now, unfortunately, children around the world face an urgent and systemic historical threat. It is an unprecedented decline in international aid. And when I say unprecedented, I mean think of the 2008-9 financial crisis, except no one is bailing out the children. The ironic thing is this is not a crisis of finance, it's a crisis of conscience, right? Let's be clear how little money we're talking. We're talking a fraction of a single percentage point of GDP in rich countries. And how we respond is going to determine the world that children inherit. For now, the response is very clear. Hard-earned gains on the back of hard-earned donor money, we are seeing declines in child and maternal mortality, immunisation coverage, access to education, which is the best dollar you can ever spend. They're all slowly starting to unravel. Australians, of course, everyone, ever since my earliest days, yes, as Morris said in Goulburn, we pride ourselves on hard work. It's very much a part of who we are. But those struggling without safety nets or without opportunity work just as hard. And that's why aid matters. In fragile places, aid, it's not an extra, it's essential. And we really are in this together. Somehow, just years after COVID, we seem to have forgotten, how quickly a cough can bring the planet to its knees. Which takes me to the Congo. Earlier this year, I travelled by plane, by road, and then boat to an Mpox clinic in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We wore the gowns, we wore the masks, I spoke with recovering patients, many of them children. Mpox is a horrendous disease. It's lethal, but it's also visually very, very difficult for the sufferers and for the communities. So I met dozens of young volunteers who were bravely going amongst very, very nervous communities explaining the virtues of vaccination. I met health staff who sat with these Mpox patients even when conflict broke out and the police bolted and the prisons opened. These people were all bright, they were relentless, they were brave. Not one of them understood now why their greatest challenge is funding. And I don't have a principled answer, and I don't have a practical one, because diseases don't know borders. And if we just take the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it's been the epicentre of multiple global disease outbreaks: Mpox, Ebola, cholera. So when governments cut support for healthcare, for surveillance and for healthcare prevention, they endanger everyone. The weaker their world becomes, the weaker our world becomes. In Haiti this year, I flew into the capital, Port-au-Prince, because the only safe way into that capital is by air. We came by helicopter. As soon as you land, armed guards take you, rush you off, put you in an armoured vehicle. No time for hellos in a city where abduction is business. Now, everywhere I went in Port-au-Prince, I had close protection. There were radio checks every 10 minutes. There was several security guards who were always looking to see if gangs had spotted you and how long we had before gangs could then mobilise. So we were moving fast because in Haiti, kidnappings are an economy for gangs, which is ironic because several decades ago, I could barely raise $20 in the 40-hour famine in Goulburn. There I was a fundraiser, and now suddenly in Haiti, I was apparently the investment. And that is your one laugh of the day, folks. I apologise. But so that was me. That's that level of security. But the teachers and the health workers in Port-au-Prince, they don't have guards. They don't have escorts. They walk through gang territory to get to a UNICEF nutrition centre every day. At the hospital, I saw female nurses, leaving their guns in the lockers. So they survive the crossfire, only now to lose to indifference. They don't have a threat inside a medical centre or a school of bullets. It's the empty shelves. It's the funding that's gone. But still, the teachers, the health workers, they turn up. Meanwhile, those who sleep soundly in faraway capitals, whose children are never afraid or hungry, they're the ones tightening the budgets, cutting the very funds that keep those most vulnerable children alive. Ladies and gentlemen, the erosion of multilateralism and the slashing of aid budgets they're two sides of the same moral retreat. When powerful states disregard international humanitarian laws, that signals that rules are optional. When the same nations cut aid, they show that compassion is too. Both sides reflect not just a collapse of systems, but of empathy, a world that's turning inward while crises multiply. So the fewer people who care, of course, make it easier for leaders to look away. Now, returning to Gaza. It takes me a moment to return to Gaza. Every time I go back, one of the first questions I'd be asked is, has it gotten worse? Whereas, really the only answer was, how much worse has it gotten? Sometimes it was just hard to fathom how much worse. No one ever gets used. I don't think that hardened journalists or myself get used to seeing children with the bomb blast wounds, burns. I didn't know there was such a thing as fourth-degree burns, the bullet wounds and so on. But my last mission, my penultimate mission rather, in the middle of this year, such was the lack of painkillers and of medicines. It wasn't just seeing these children with the wounds of war, you'd hear them. Now, so for me, I don't know, think of a toothache or an earache, that insufferable pain, or better still, think of your child who's got a toothache or an earache and your absolute desperation to ease that suffering. With pain relief medications into Gaza severely restricted, I sat with a little 8-year-old girl, Sella. An airstrike on her home, disproportionate amount of airstrikes on homes and tents were at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. That's when hers was. It meant that Sella had both her legs up to the hips amputated. She was allowed, based on supplies, 1 dose of painkiller a day. It was not nearly enough to dull a fraction of the pain. Her father would have this cool cloth, as we would, just to sort of put it across her head, I guess praying it would do what medicine certainly would. Sella didn't speak, she just cried. So again, to that question, have things gotten worse in Gaza? Look, suffering in Gaza is cumulative. The trauma calcifies. We are in uncharted territory. Every child psychologist I speak to, and I speak to many Palestinians and in Western nations, we are in uncharted territory. And the destruction, what was once people's homes, just piles up. And meanwhile, the hunger grows sharper. Here's the thing with malnutrition. It's not just making a child thin. It's about making them defenceless to disease. Malnutrition strips a child's body of the vitamins and the proteins it needs to ward off disease. And there was a 500% increase in acute malnutrition among children in Gaza in the first 6 months of this year. So at that exact time where children's immune systems were at their very weakest, a blockade was placed on humanitarian aid. And the world allowed it to happen again. Now, Israel provided no evidence of meaningful aid diversion from Hamas. We can speak to that later. And there was even less logic in a blockade of just life-saving supplies into Gaza. Allegations of stealing food is one thing. Again, no evidence of meaningful diversion. But that's one thing, though, worth recalling, that starvation of civilians as a method of warfare is prohibited under international law. But leaving that aside for a moment, why the bans on incubators for newborns, banned since March 2024. Why are the bans on education materials? Still banned today, more than 2 years. Why are the bans on breastfeeding kits for midwives or antigens for vaccines? Still banned. Folks, it was in this context that I made my 5th mission to Gaza at the start of June, with the entire population, as I say, facing acute food insecurity and 500,000 people on the edge of starvation. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, called the GHF, was launched. It was a private mechanism to deliver aid, a militarised private mechanism, basically sidelining the United Nations and all those established aid agencies. So in short, the 400 distribution points that the United Nations and very brave Palestinian partners, 400 across the Gaza Strip, became 4. 3 in the south, 1 in the middle, militarised. GHF was, in a dark irony, being sold as a way of keeping famine at bay. Now, humanitarian aid is about 2 things. It's going to where people need it, where the most vulnerable people are who need it, and ensuring that you're making a difference, making sure you're following your data, that you actually are improving things. The GHF did neither of those. 4 militarised hubs replaced 400 neutral ones, cutting off the elderly, the wounded, the sick, children, pretty much everyone, from life-saving supplies. Now, why do I share all this? Because, yes, truth in Gaza was blurred, but it wasn't hidden, you know? But the narrative that aid was endlessly diverted prevailed, and it led to famine, doing immense damage to children and the rules-based order that is meant to protect them. As soon as the GHF started, we got all these reports coming in from field hospitals and from Palestinians who I knew, all saying very, very similar things, that the Palestinians who would go there, usually young men, wasn't the most vulnerable, but it was those who could go, they'd be corralled into caged-off areas. Quadcopters would then direct them when they could move. There'd be firing, there'd be chaos, there'd be boxes, people would grab what they could, most people would grab nothing, and that would be that distribution over. From the very, very first days, we received reports from field hospitals of mass casualty events. Field hospitals had their biggest mass casualty events on the back of the GHF, not on the back of day-to-day war. At the same time, we had continued denials about the responsibility of who was being shot, of who was being wounded at these. And it was that time I went back into Gaza, so I went to Nasser Hospital. And I met a 13-year-old boy in the hospital, Abed al-Rahman. Incredibly brave little boy, terrible injuries, again, lack of painkillers. Wanted to tell his story, also hopeful for medical evacuation. Unfortunately, that has been blocked for a long, long time, predominantly by Israel and now by Western nations just not opening their hearts nor hospital doors. But he wanted to tell his story. And so he sat up, this little boy who had a horrific wound in his stomach and his spleen, sat up and held onto my arm. Incredible, 13-year-old kid. And his story was that his father had given him money to go and buy bread. Family's starving, right? There's no income. The market is small and hyper expensive. Haven't had a job. It's the family's last money. He knows how physically stressed his mum is and his brother and his dad, given money to go and buy food. He walks out onto the street and he hears there's this new distribution point. No one really understands it. It's early. So Abed al-Rahman goes there. Same thing, corralled into a cage, quadcopter, he runs, and then there's a tank shell that's fired and it explodes, and that's why he's got shrapnel through his spleen and abdomen. And that was an important story, as journalists will appreciate, because while all the denials about who's firing at civilians, there's only one side in Gaza with tanks. It was horrific, this little boy telling his story, because at the same time his father, a very proud man, was in tears, feeling somehow he'd let his son down. His son was feeling very guilty. Abed al-Rahman even said in Arabic he felt guilty for putting his family in this situation. I went back to see him in the same hospital a week ago. His mum again clutching this medical evacuation form as if it meant something. His condition had deteriorated significantly. And then a week later, I got a call that Abed had died of those wounds. So a 13-year-old boy trying to get food for his starving family, killed. You know, folks, I think about a year ago, I had this realisation when I was in a hospital. And again, I was sitting with a little boy whose family had been killed. First time I met a child whose entire family had been killed in November 2023. I'd never heard of such a thing. I never thought I'd see it again. I've now heard it so many times, it's not remarkable. It's horrific. Every one of them gives me a shudder, but It's, it's double digits. And so I was sitting with this little boy with his injuries, and he hadn't been told yet that his entire family had been killed. And I realised that I spent most of my adult life advocating for the rights of children. And at its core, it's not complicated. Certainly it shouldn't be controversial, right? It's a child's right to education, a child's right to safety and protection, a child's right to food. But crouching next to this terrified, wounded little child, another terrified, wounded child, I realised that Gaza was the first time in my career where I had to begin with, these are actually children, right? These little humans warrant rights, and then work from there. For nearly 80 years, the rules of war and child rights and the global institutions built around them have been like an insurance policy. Humanitarian law sought to protect journos, aid workers, civilians, and in doing so protect this high moral ground that distinguished democracies from the tyrannies that they oppose. But the erosion of international law has ripple effects far beyond individual conflicts. It undermines all our multilateral institutions, the same bodies we rely on to respond to pandemics, to respond to the climate crisis. If we can't enforce the laws of war, how can we expect countries to collaborate on something as critical as climate change? What I think should also alarm us is that what young Australian children are learning as they watch this unfold. They see the rules of law meant to protect civilians and children seem to depend on who the child is or where the child is. So this generation risks being taught that fairness is optional, compassion is negotiable. The good news, I have good news. The international community does have the tools to correct course, right? The nations have to recommit to the Geneva Conventions and recognise that international laws are not just moral imperatives, they're practical ones. Leaders who flout the laws must be held accountable, not selectively, but universally. And if this sounds idealistic, then I guess ask yourselves, what is the alternative? And so, where is Gaza now? Everyone in this room knows the power of a human story versus unfathomably big numbers. But in Gaza, numbers still count. Almost every Palestinian has been displaced, many more than 5 or 10 times. You've all seen the obliteration of homes and hospitals and schools. 92% of schools require partial or complete reconstruction. 89% of the water and sanitation network has been damaged. When you've got 90% of something damaged or destroyed, it doesn't show the scale of destruction, it shows the way this war has been fought. And so the final statistic, 9 out of 10 residential buildings, homes, have been damaged or destroyed. Yes, another 90%. Which leaves me with the first boy the first boy I met who has not since died, the first boy I met in Gaza who I still get to visit regularly, Omar. Omar, when I met him, was 9, now he's 11, so he was 9. Both his parents were killed in an airstrike, as was his twin brother. Omar has these piercing blue eyes. And as we spoke, we were sitting outside their tent, just, pushing a football together, trying to, everyone relax in that environment. And Omar was speaking, was explaining how things were, but for long periods he'd close his eyes, he'd just shut them, which I really noticed because he had these amazing eyes. And I asked his auntie, why does Omar close his eyes? And she said, look, he knows that he's lost his parents and his twin brother, but he's terrified of losing the image of them in his mind, so he closes his eyes to try and see them. I saw Omar, a month ago, 5 weeks ago, and he told me, quote, I don't remember what my parents and my brother look like anymore, but I remember my home and them in my home. I hope I can return to where my home was. I hope I can. Hope. A final thought. The Palestinians I met were rarely wrong about posturing in their region, right? Ceasefires have become rituals of disappointment. They've seen it all before. But when ceasefires did happen, Palestinians went home. They went back, always. And then when the bombing returned, they picked up what they could. They rolled up their bedding. Always in it somewhere was hope. Because as a Palestinian man said to me, a few weeks ago, look, James, when you've had everything taken from you, your loved one, your home, the ability to feed your children, the ability to keep your children safe, the only thing you have agency over is hope. And I saw much to be hopeful for. I met a man who had nothing but had sold everything and had a greenhouse and bought seeds and planted tomatoes and eggplants, and every time that they germinated, doesn't sound like much of a Goulburn boy, does it? Every time that they became tomatoes and eggplants, he would give them to the community. I met a surgeon who started his day at 5 a.m. every day in a tent, because surgeons, like everyone else, have had their homes bombed. Start at 5 a.m, look for water for his family, then look for water for an elderly woman who was living in a tent with her orphan grandchild. Then he would go off to do his 18-hour shift in a war zone. Still, amid such, apocalyptic scenes, some people call Palestinians' hope naive. They call it a blind spot, and perhaps it is. But as blind spots go, it's a good one to have. And from my time in Gaza, I certainly share it. But the world must not mistake this hope for resilience that can be endlessly stretched, right? Science is unequivocal. You leave malnutrition untreated in a child and you have cognitive decline. UNICEF has seen that time again. Cognitive decline affects the society, the family, the community, the economy. Equally, there comes a point where trauma reaches such a critical mass that entire communities exist in a state of shock and awe. So what must we do now? Well, we've got to seize every opportunity and replace this military offensive with a humanitarian one. Aid workers must finally, hasn't happened yet, be given unimpeded access to Gaza through every available entry point. Funding must be available for blankets, for books, for tents, for medicines, and eventually a massive, massive rebuilding effort. For 2 years, there was a choice, do something or look the other way. Most with influence chose the latter. In that time, tens of thousands of girls and boys were killed. Twice that number have been injured. The history books will no doubt tell us that things could have been done differently, but for now, we have to turn the page and take action. Presidents and lawmakers in the US, in the Middle East, in Europe, and yes, very much here in Australia, have a narrow window to turn this ceasefire into something lasting and meaningful and letting aid flow. All those must choose courage over comfort, empathy over indifference. And those with power, be it corporate or be it political, may also do well to remember that when they take a stand, it also tells young people something profound, that integrity still exists, that the rules we wrote still mean something, that might does not make right, or in the words of a dear, dear young friend I made in Gaza, that the lives of all children, Palestinian, Israeli, Sudanese, all children everywhere matter. Thank you very much.
A lot to take in. Thanks very much, James. One thing you said struck me when you said in Gaza the truth was blurred but not hidden. So someone who's obviously been in Gaza 6 times and also seeing the perspective of the Western media that couldn't get in, what should have been more obvious? What should have been reported more over the past 2 years in your view along that line of it being blurred but not actually hidden?
I think there was a systematic attempt to, because of course we know there were journalists on the ground, right? A lot of Palestinian journalists, and I think there was a systematic, very successful attempt to discredit those journalists. In fact, I would go even further. There was an attempt to discredit them to the point of linking them to terrorist groups. That's why we've seen hundreds of journalists killed. So there were eyes on the ground. As I say, Tom, in those notes, I certainly, as a humanitarian, I'm limited by how much truth I can tell. I have a mandate. We're an apolitical organisation. And yet you are faced up at times in interviews and elsewhere with a member state or member states who have absolute freedom to share falsehoods. And there came a point, I think, where so many times that it was demonstrably clear that a statement had been made that was no longer true, and therefore there should have been a more circumspect, rather than always feeling the need to counter a story with, but country X says to so-called balance the story. You know, I think it's about being objective in the pursuit of truth, you know, not neutral in the face of lies. So I think there was a...
When you talk about all the humanitarian crises, disasters, the horrific war scenes you've witnessed, a lot of them it's been a case of them not getting much attention. Gaza has got a lot of attention, but still not a lot of change. Has that been the singular difference in your time? That's actually something you don't often need to make people aware of, but for want of a better word, politics of it is so dire that even though all the attention is there, which I'm sure there's so many areas, you know, you wish could get the amount of attention Gaza gets, but without necessarily aid and other change coming with it.
Yes, absolutely, Tom, and it speaks to your question about just why. My job, ideally, when I was in Ukraine, 50% of my job is to try and explain what's happening to children and turn a big military geopolitical conflict into understanding, as ever, who this impacts the most, and it is children always, just based on vulnerability, it's children. But 50% is to show what UNICEF is doing, and we are doing a lot, and then to raise money, because there is no magic pot of money for UNICEF. In Gaza, it felt like 99% of my role, as someone said, was to bear witness, because there was just such an absence of what was clearly happening on the ground. But at the same time, it's strange, because as the attention was there, but it was not the attention speaking to truth and reality. Whilst famine was declared in Gaza and Sudan, is the first time in history that famine's been declared, and we saw no noticeable increase in funding whatsoever. And that's problematic. Now, that in Gaza, of course, is problematic because there is the narrative that all aid is blocked and looted and so on, and that's an important point. It really is one. Looting is economics of scarcity. Right? There are two ways there is aid diversion. Right? One is looting and one is aid diversion. Looting is basically the long blockades. If you imagine Barton, nothing comes into Barton for 10 weeks, nothing. No tents, no soap, no water, bombs and missiles come in, nothing else. And then a few trucks, the officials are a few trucks down one designated route. There are half a dozen, but down one route. The economics of scarcity means people take what they can get. When the United Nations was allowed sustained aid, people trusted that the truck they saw wouldn't be the last. The black market disappeared, and suddenly there was no looting, which takes you to aid diversion, which is probably a more serious allegation because that's Hamas taking it. International Crisis Group reported less than 1%. United Nations asked time and time again for evidence, and there simply wasn't any. And as I say, that would be evidence of food beyond all those other aspects of humanitarian aid. So there was a willingness, unfortunately, to again always take the word of a member state rather than query evidence on the ground.
First question from the floor is someone who did a lot to help make this happen. Anna McDonald from Women in Media.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you for a wonderful speech, and thank you for everything you've done. So today you are in the National Capital on the 50th anniversary of the dismissal of the Whitlam government. That happened just around the corner. By today's standards, I think Gough Whitlam could fairly be described as pro-Palestinian. He favoured Palestinian statehood. He expressed concerns about human rights abuses there. He wanted Israel out of the occupied territories. He wanted a more even-handed approach. And he publicly questioned the might and power of the Israeli lobby in Australia and around the world. What do you think Gough Whitlam would say if he saw Gaza today? And what do you think Gough Whitlam would say if he saw the Albanese government's response to the genocide?
I, of course, wasn't born when Gough was around. And it's a great question. It is, regrettably, so far outside my mandate. But my understanding from Gough Whitlam was, one of his greatest legacies was reform and was holding the world to a moral currency. So I think he would share that idea that there are very, very principled reasons why things should be done very differently for those in Gaza and those in the West Bank, but there are also very, very practical reasons. And if we lose that moral currency, then everybody loses. And that is a fair segue to the West Bank, which I haven't spoken of, haven't been into, but simple things Gough would have known of the West Bank. That this year alone, there's 100 children who have been arbitrarily detained. That means detained with no court case, with no arrest. They're just detained in a prison somewhere. I think he would have had a very vocal, prominent voice on those things.
Thank you.
Stephen Jedgetts from the ABC.
Thank you, James, for your very moving speech. Can I just ask a bit more broadly on the question of ODA and the humanitarian budget more broadly? The Australian government, as you know, has essentially projected flatlining foreign aid in real terms, or perhaps slightly declining foreign aid over the coming 5 to 10 years or so. Given the scale of some of the humanitarian challenges that you've outlined, do you hold any hope that agencies like yours are able to convince the federal government that a substantively different approach is necessary? And do you hold out any hope that the government may be persuaded to make real increases and substantial increases beyond the forwards?
Thanks, Stephen. As I say, hope is my blind spot. Look, I'm very conscious that this government has given $130 million plus to agencies across Palestine. That is absolutely not nothing. As an Australian you're very proud when you're an Australian working abroad. We have a very good reputation, and a lot of that is because we like to punch above our weight in all things that we do. We risk losing that with, this is a great time. The bang for our buck, because so many countries, percentage of ODA, and I think Australia, we look at more as a percentage of the federal budget. And therefore the aim is 1% of the federal budget. It's less than 2/3 of that. So at the very least, yes, getting to that level, being very respectful of a cost of living crisis, but getting to that level elevates Australia hugely. And I would imagine elevates Australia in all sorts of ways that are not, again, my privy, in terms of trade and so on. We want a seat on the UN Security Council. So I think there's real hope showing the results of humanitarian aid, particularly in the Pacific, and showing again that we're not isolated, disease knows no borders and so forth. But yeah, there's a very good reason to get the government to that 1%.
Thank you.
How has private donations, how have they tracked, particularly perhaps in relation to Gaza? You've spoken about countries, but what about private donations?
Yeah, Tom, very, very well. I'm looking more globally. As I say, UNICEF is entirely donor funded, be it governments, but now just over 50% of ours is from individuals. And that may literally be, your pledge donor $50 a month to a wealthy individual. So they've been consistently strong. Unfortunately, as I've mentioned here, I've only mentioned a few countries, there are many others, the need keeps outstripping supply. Individual donors are easy in a sense because you will do a bilateral discussion with them, very clearly explaining where their money is going for. We call it unearmarked money as well. It's not ideal that a donor gives money because they want it for nutrition in Papua New Guinea. It's better, as any of you running companies or businesses know, to let the experts determine it, and a lot of private donors do that, so it's been a bright spot.
Anna Henderson from SBS.
Thank you. Anna Henderson from SBS. Thank you very much for your speech, James. In terms of the debate that you've seen unfold on some of the facts around what's taken place in Gaza, a few months ago the world saw pictures of emaciated children. One picture of a child's body being held by his mother compelled the Australian Prime Minister to counter claims that there was not starvation in Gaza and to increase the robustness of the Australian government's language. There was, after that, some controversy, though, when it emerged that some of the children had underlying health conditions. It did lead to claims from Israel about whether or not there was starvation in Gaza. As one of the few people who's seen things on the ground, witnessed it firsthand, what are the facts here, and what impact do you think that particular debate had on international perceptions of the war?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, unfortunately there is starvation. There's more than 100 children have died of starvation in Gaza. The famine is by the world's preeminent body, never been questioned previously. Very, very difficult for it to do a famine declaration. Unfortunately, ticked all the boxes. In my own anecdotal experience of being there, every time you go there, you see how much more thin people are. If we take that single example, it's not unimportant. Around some children had underlying conditions, and I certainly saw those children who had underlying conditions die. The difference is, again, that children with underlying conditions also don't starve to death. They only starve to death if they're a lack of medicines and a lack of food, or in places a lack of water. I mean, for the first time ever, I was in hospitals where, yes, I was used to seeing wounded children. I wasn't used to seeing mums and newborns. I saw hospital corridors with mums and newborns on the corridors. Again, these are hospitals that 2 years ago, any of you would have gone to, taken an elderly one, taken a child to. So, 3 babies on a single bed sharing oxygen cylinders, again, because we can't get incubators in. And the narrative didn't surprise me. Probably, the United Nations, we should have been much faster at that. We believed the level of detail that goes into those, what's called IPC reports, the level of detail that goes into declaring a famine by absolute technocrats. Once that's finally done, you're done. We made the mistake of not thinking, of course, that like everything else, this is going to be he said, she said, and there's going to be no famine. And I know that there are certain governments, very big governments in Europe, where within 2 hours of that declaration, members of parliament were getting WhatsApp messages from lobby groups basically sharing, as you say, debunking it, not real, not real. And it took us 2 days to recalibrate, to explain, well, absolutely, ticks these boxes, yes there are, and as you say, yes, some photos were of children who were starving with underlying conditions, but unfortunately, there was famine, there is famine. There were 3 blockades. There were blockades on the entire Gaza Strip. At the same time as there were blockades, I mentioned one of the things that struck me very much when I was last there, which was hearing children with pain. The other thing I was stunned by was the lack of water. Again, all the claims of looting and aid diversion, ignoring that you can't use food as a weapon, as a method of warfare, but water. But Israel controls water. They control the pipelines, they control the electricity, they control the fuel for desalination plants. They hadn't allowed fuel in for 100 days. So suddenly the stress in communities, when you're suddenly down to 5 or 6 litres of water, and of course your children are sick and they're malnourished, that's that collision on a child's body. So I guess we should have been unsurprised by the allegations and ready to meet them in the same hour, because as you know, 2 days in social media is a long time.
Thank you.
Next question comes from Corey McLeod from Innovation Oz.
Thank you so much for your address. It's very harrowing, and you've outlined all of the really critical issues right now, whether it's water and health. And with that in mind, as Gaza starts to rebuild, and that in itself is a massive task, you mentioned some of the conversations you were having with international colleagues about mental health, intergenerational trauma, and some of the support around post-traumatic stress, which has to be absolutely acute. Are there practical things that we need to be aware of what that might look like? There is a whole generation of people who are in shock.
It's a great question, and I really have tried so hard, and I keep going back to that line that I be told about uncharted territory. UNICEF did some amazing work. I would see it a year ago, 6 months ago, where you'd find a tent in a relatively safe place. But what is a safe place? And we do trauma counselling for children. Many of these children had lost family members. Many children in Gaza don't just lose family members; they see that family member get killed. And you'd have counsellors doing trauma work, and I remember a little girl explaining to me, she was taught to find her happy place, and I was like, where is your happy place? She said it's her grandfather's vegetable garden, and sometimes she even tries to smell the sage. But at the same point, as she's explaining this, you're hearing airstrikes. So counsellors in Gaza would explain that there is no PTSD because the P is post, and there's no post, and traumas are constantly intersecting. So I had other counsellors explain to me in 2024, when there was talk of a ceasefire, I don't feel many areas that I claim some expertise on. I thought all ceasefire discussions in 2024 were a charade. But her concern was when there's finally a ceasefire, that trauma would worsen because families, they knew their house had been destroyed, or they knew that, but they'd go back and they would see the rubble and they'd have a moment to breathe, and that's happened. And I spoke to all those families after that ceasefire in January, and most of them felt that things got worse. So that's now where they are. So it doesn't answer your question, but it does again speak to that we need the ceasefire to hold. 2 weeks ago it was broken for 24 hours and 30 children were killed. That cannot be a daily thing. We need counsellors. Education is such a mainstay. But education in Gaza, as so many of you would know, is one of the highest literacy rates in the world, one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. And that education rate, that's why they have hope. But their hope is not just a term, it's hope for a better future, and the better future is built on education. So when they had a ceasefire in January, February, and things bounced back, and colleagues would say that they were going for cappuccinos and pizza and supermarkets full, looking like Woolies, and I couldn't imagine it. And it's not because of some nice feel-good reason. It's because they have systems in place. They've been here. They have a very high education rate. That for UNICEF is as terrifying for us as any other aspect. There are 600,000 children. They can't go into those schools. So temporary learning spaces. We are denied bringing in education materials. So as much as every area, polio, vaccines, nutrition, of course, are critical, we would put education very much on that podium for the very reason you mentioned, which is trauma.
Thank you.
Dominic Giannini from AAP.
Thank you so much for your speech, for your work and for being the eyes and ears for Western journalists in Gaza. I just want to ask, in terms of war crimes, you've mentioned indiscriminate bombings and attacks. Just want to ask you what you saw in terms of targeted attacks. We've heard stories about children who have small bullet wound groupings, for example, which suggest targeting. We've heard stories about sniper shots, again, which suggest specific targeting of children. Just want to ask what evidence you saw there. And I just want to, I guess, more broadly, do you see an end to this callous indifference that you described from the political class?
Dominic, thanks. What I saw is obviously anecdotal, but I saw a lot, and I spoke to a lot of doctors. And it's important to remember, I think, when you speak to doctors and parents, two things. One is that at no point are there minders. In Sudan, in Khartoum, I've often got a government minder, and you're trying to get an honest conversation with someone, knowing that they're wary. That's not the case. So I feel I read people fairly well. At no point in the hundreds of conversations did I feel anything was ever learned. And also speaking to that level of education, as much as you could speak to 50 people, all of whom had tents shelled in the middle of the night, they all had a slightly different story just because of their education rates. So if I go back anecdotally, and I could have a dozen of these which I could share, but top of my head, my last mission, very first day I was in the hospital. The first tent I walked into outside Al-Aqsa Hospital in the middle area, Deribala, there were 3 children who'd all been shot by quadcopters in tents. That little girl getting water, that boy playing, and I'm not sure the third, all shot by quadcopters. Multiple doctors will explain to me, particularly around the GHF, but elsewhere, certain days. So Thursday is very much a day, and all the injuries they get in, people are shot in the hips. Tuesday, heavily, people shot in the groin. And we've seen those testimonies. Doctors in the United Kingdom, the United States, have made those very formal testimonies. So unfortunately, that moved away from being anecdotal because you have surgeons speaking very regularly to that type of thing. I think the Lancet did a study looking at the age categories of children where most had been wounded, and it was often children around the 3 to 7 age bracket, because after an airstrike and they were fleeing, if you're under 3, chances are your parents carrying you, or if you're over 7 or 8, you're running a bit faster. If you're under that age, you're running, and they're the children who are invariably, according to the Lancet, shot. Not targeted, shot. So unfortunately, yes. And we now know, I mean, it's important to bear witness, as you say, but we've now heard many testimonies from senior officials. There are senior officials in government who make very clear claims about their intentions. There are off-the-record quotes you read from former soldiers and so on. So unfortunately, the evidence is mounting up. The indifference, I don't know. I've just been in Germany and Canada and was amazed by how many people, are able to hold multiple contradictory thoughts at the same time, to understand the horrific events of October 7 and understand the horrific events that happened day after day, and why there now needs to be something very, very different. But I think we'll see it now, both in terms of how much pressure is held to really turn this ceasefire, into something meaningful, and funding. We saw it. That's what I mean. There are examples where it's been possible. After Bosnia, Yugoslavia, donor governments fell over themselves writing billion-dollar checks. That does need to happen again for Gaza. I do feel anecdotal. In my heart, I feel, Dominic, that there's almost 2 types of people. There's people who have cared deeply about this, everyone in this room, and just want it to stop, and people who've turned away and hopefully feel a degree of guilt and just want it to stop. But it's not stopping right now. The level of repairing psychologically and physically, requires that callous indifference to absolutely swap into fiscal support.
Thank you again.
From your conversations, understanding if you talk about the countries in the region, if ceasefire somehow holds and becomes more permanent, could this perversely be a chance for Gaza to actually have more of that hope you spoke about? With 9 out of 10 residential buildings damaged or destroyed, it's in such a state that it just has to have a lot of that money and effort and aid tipped into it. Could that actually come at the end of that, do you think? Would there be more willingness to do that from some of the neighbouring Arab nations, do you think, if the ceasefire holds?
I think it's a good question. That has to be, not even just the hope, it just has to happen. There is an obligation. I mean, there is an obligation anywhere. And again, we talk in these crazy numbers, and they're big numbers, but to those countries in the region, they're not, as they are not to, There are donor governments around the world, who are cutting aid heavily and whose citizens feel that they give around $20 out of every 100 of GNI in foreign aid, and they give 24 cents. So it's not a lot of money. In principle, it makes sense, but I think, yes, they absolutely need to do that rebuild. And Palestinians have to be shown that it's happening, else then you risk another whole problem, which is a brain drain. Your very best and brightest Palestinians, luckily the education rate is such that most Palestinians are your best and brightest, but your very best and brightest will be here and in Canada, and Gaza. And Palestinians do want to stay, but not without school, hospital or home.
Melissa Code from the Mandarin.
Hi, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. I wonder if you could reflect for us how assessing the scale and pace of this horror is different perhaps to others, and maybe even make a comment on general public's aversion to perceiving it all with fatigue and maybe their aversion to, so-called trauma porn.
Yeah. Hi, Melissa. Pace and scale, unlike anything I've seen, we risk, it's again, I think, why we need multilateralism to really hold firm right now. I mean, warfare is changing. There are more non-state actors, there are more atrocities, there are more member states who are at risk of breaking international law. There are more types of warfare that don't require, people in armed combat in terms of things like drones. So we really, really risk things getting much worse in terms of pace and scale. No, I've never seen it. Many things in Gaza I did not think I would see, and then each time they would be considerably worse. I don't have any military background whatsoever, and I came to learn very quickly in November, December 2023 how the distance of a 2,000-pound bomb and how far away that is. And a 2,000-pound bomb, a kilometre away, shakes the rooms. A 2,000-pound bomb 400 metres away breaks the glass. And that was night after night after night, to the point where your colleagues would speak, at some point there'd be a quiet night and no one slept because that's where you start to realise levels of trauma. So no, the pace of scale, and there is a level of guilt in Gaza. There's a level of guilt when you get a bottle of water. There's a level of guilt because you can have a shower every day. You can get a meal every day. Sometimes only one meal, but there is. And as I've said previously, I would have a level of guilt because the relentlessness of bombardments would mean that at night time with the building shaking, I'd put a pillow over my head to sleep. It's because I need to function the next day. And there's a 7-year-old girl 100 metres out there in a tent who's not putting a pillow over her head. So no, I don't think anyone's seen the pace and scale. And you would know that there are numbers in terms of the quantity of bombardments that have been in that small Gaza Strip. And fatigue, yeah, and this is very much my own opinion. I think people should have breaks from the media. As I mentioned earlier with what I've learned from my own kids and their friends and generation, it's a lot. They see a huge amount and they see silence and complicity and immense hypocrisy. They see it next to a beautiful response of how the world responded to Ukraine and to Ukrainian refugees, and then 5 minutes later they see a very, very different response at a time where, and I'm thinking again young people are focused on the umbrella of issues, which is a climate crisis or a mental health crisis. So I completely understand that fatigue. I don't think our political leaders have any reason whatsoever to show that fatigue in terms of their leadership, be it moral or financial.
Next question from Julia Hare.
Thank you very much. I'm feeling a bit raw at the moment, I'll tell you that. I've got 2 questions, if you will indulge me. My first one is that last week the Sydney Peace Prize winner Navi Pillay spoke here. She's an eminent jurist and a former, until recently, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. She found that there had been genocide in Gaza, that it was genocide in Gaza, and that it now sat with the International Court of Justice. I struggle to understand how the concept of genocide in Gaza is contested and why it is contested. And if the International Court of Justice does find genocide, that genocide has occurred, what difference that will make in any real way. And the second thing I want to ask you is, how should Australian parents and teachers speak to their own children about what's going on there?
Well, thank you. Yeah, the first question, I mean, again, so outside of UNICEF's mandate or expertise on genocide, but as you say, there are many preeminent people, and I think someone here knows, someone far better and brighter than myself, Francesca Albanese, would have spoken here not long ago. I think accountability is absolutely critical as we move forward. There is a problem now that we are not having the same international courts having the discussions that need to be had. You know, we think about the courts that were set up around Rwanda, think about the courts that were set up around Bosnia. That's not happening. It's not happening because of political will. It's not happening because of these things take time and money, and all these things, political will, time and money, are all in short supply, and that's a real problem if we're going to push accountability, because without accountability, we lead into Sudan. In terms of parents and children, yeah, great question. Look, obviously, as always, the age of the children. I think all these conversations are very, very important to have, and I think particularly in Australia, because I feel as someone here, the great fortune of Australia is our distance. Our great fortune is our lifestyle, and and those things. But it is our distance. But that distance can be problematic. So I think we need to have those conversations, mostly about gratitude. And again, I speak for myself as a kid from a middle-class family in Goulburn, and I don't speak for people who've had a much rockier upbringing. But I think if people start with understanding a level of gratitude to what they've got, then there isn't that endless demand for, something better, something more supply, a level of appreciation for what I have, and then a sense that bleeds very easily into empathy for others. So I think it should be a conversation, but starting around our own hopeful good fortune.
Thank you.
Next question, Nick Stewart from Ability News.
Thanks for your speech. When you describe a bus arriving, we can viscerally smell exactly what you've described. And yet, as we pan backwards from the specifics, the individual case of killing or shooting or whatever, to the broader, it starts becoming a sniper, a tank blast. There's no accountability for that. How is it that we restore accountability into this whole situation so that instead of talking about something happening as a concept, it becomes Netanyahu's war or somebody else's individual decision that has prompted the killing to go on? Thank you very much. I'm flattered we are getting so outside my mandate now. No, I mean, I do believe that, as I say, those multilateral mechanisms of accountability are failing. As I say, we are not having those moments. There's less consensus on these things happening, and that's a problem. And that's a problem, as we all know, because it will have ramifications going forward. You see many other member states being very clear that that there will be accountability. But I think Sudan is a good place to segue to. One of the terrifying things of Gaza was and I think it's what you're alluding to, is not just what was happening in Gaza, though that is unlike anything most of us will see. It is the precedent being laid. So there is a reason I talk about the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, not just because it was the most abhorrent thing we've seen, but because there were certainly warring parties around the world, non-state actors and state actors looking at that and thinking, is this the new way we can deliver aid? We get to choose who we give aid to. So it was very important that was debunked, and it can't be now mirrored again. And we need to see what happens in Gaza now. So I don't have a better answer other than those with power, those jurists, like you said, Navi, but those with power need to, in all mechanisms, hold people to account.
Hearing you today, James, and I'm sure it's the tip of the iceberg for a lot of the stories you've told, but even just one, thinking about Omar, I guess in one sense I think, how long can you keep going to the front line? But then maybe on the flip side, do people like Omar make it impossible to stop going back?
Yeah, it's a nice question. Yes, yeah. I mean, there absolutely is a responsibility. I have a brilliant 25-year-old colleague in Gaza, Rawan, and so every hospital I go into, when we spend hours in hospitals and walking across scenes, and that story I mentioned previously of the 3 children with quadcopters, then I walked into the rest of that hospital. My first 30 minutes in that hospital was those 3 children with quadcopters. Then we went in, there was a boy who'd been shot at the GHF. His mother was screaming because he hadn't had care for 5 hours. At this 30 minutes, then a little girl came in, she was 5, and she'd just been pulled from the rubble. Literally that scene of all the dust and ash. And they quickly looked and she didn't have any major injuries. We thought, oh my goodness, what a result. Then to realise that her mum and her sister had been killed in that blast. And then we went into a makeshift ICU, and there was a little girl, and I was hearing from the doctor what had happened to her. She was 6 years old and she died in front of me. That was 30 minutes. These aren't a regular time. So Rawan does all that with me. Rawan's house was destroyed. Rawan called off her marriage because she refuses to get married at a time of war. So in answer to how much you can keep going, Rawan and I were talking about what television shows we watch. And she said, what are you watching now? And I said, look, I used to love everything, apart from horrors, thrillers, dramas. I said, but now I watch a comedy. And if the comedy there's some sort of suspenseful tension in comedy, I fast forward it. And Rawan said, I do that too. Okay, it's not a great sign. But no, look, I mean, as I say, I think, and Morris joked about my family from Goulburn. I got an incredible base of living in a local community and being taught very clearly by my parents and my sports club that community service is what it's about, and it gave me a very a good reservoir to draw on. So I feel an immense responsibility. And then there is, yes, I wish I hadn't seen those scenes. Yes, I wish I could get that smell out of my head. But in Gaza or Sudan, I also get to see the mum with the malnourished child, getting that emergency nutritional food. I look at in the face of a 6-year-old girl going to a temporary learning space, that level of joy. So I get those things as well, and they can sort of replenish.
Final question from Lauren Dubois.
Hello, James. Lauren Dubois from Women in Media. Thank you so much for being such a powerful voice. Your social media messaging has really been, especially in an Australian accent, it means a lot to a lot of the general public in Australia. You've become a de facto reporter in Gaza, and your message has repeatedly been, this is a war on children. And yet a lot of the traditional media seem to ignore or gloss over that message and continue to repeat the denials of the Israeli government. I wonder what you would say to mainstream media journalists who continue to prioritise the denials of Israel. And could you explain to them, perhaps, what is the difference between children who are a byproduct, like a collateral damage, an unfortunate tragedy, and children who are being targeted? And what is their responsibility to report on that honestly, and perhaps what the difference would have been if they'd been doing that from the start?
Thanks, Lauren. Yes, and as you rightly allude, UNICEF is not a news agency. We're a humanitarian agency. We're a human rights agency. But in Gaza, with international journalists flocked out and Palestinian journalists being killed in record numbers, then disinformation and misinformation was flooding in, and I do feel there was a responsibility. There was a lot of evidence that was available, as I mentioned earlier. Now, we were saying these things. So we're not a news agency, but we can't be neutral on facts. So for me, it was very clear. If I see a child starving, I have to say this child has a right to food. If I see a child with horrific bomb blast, this child has a right to medical care. It's interesting, Lauren, that you bring up war on children, because we use this term war on children. And organisations like UNICEF, we are a human rights organisation with incredible colleagues on the ground who live in very, very, very difficult circumstances. But, you know, we have member states to speak to, so the levels of clearance that went through that was not a statement for a headline. War on children is like everything I've tried to share now, apart from maybe these 10 minutes of my personal opinion. Everything else is demonstrable. It's evidence-based. War on children was based on the disproportionate number of children being killed and wounded as not just a percentage of the population, because we know they're 50%, as any conflict, going back to Syria and anything else. So war on children was just demonstrably true. It was just a statistic. And yes, for a long time, I found it very difficult because, as I've mentioned, you know, we are restricted by how much truth we can tell. Saying indiscriminate was a big remark. You know, we talked about it being indiscriminate before President Biden talked about that, but that was clearly our role, right, to try and combat that misinformation. But that misinformation has a lot of money, has a lot of wealth behind it. So I think for UNICEF, our role there was to bear witness, yes, but then to walk the corridors of power and to try to explain time and again to people what was happening. But we must be honest, here we are after 2 years. It has taken a long, long time, and I think that's what I've tried to share today, that there are very many good arguments in principle why we should never have got to this, but if they don't hold, there are very practical ones. The world, our Western world, has been so very well by international humanitarian law and the laws of war and multilateralism. Those things are under unprecedented stress.
James, I know your time's very valuable. You've given up a lot of it today on one of your precious trips home, so we very much appreciate that here at the Press Club. I'm sure the people in the room, your words will stay for a long time, and you'll probably need to stay in the room for a couple of hours. I think everyone wants to get their time with you. But ladies and gentlemen, please thank James Elder. Thank you, mate. That's your guest speaker membership. Welcome back anytime.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.